What if the most important truths we believe are built on silence? Not lies exactly, but the absence of truth, missing pieces hidden in the final breath of a dying person. It begins not with what's said, but what's held back. In hospital rooms where time runs out, in dim living rooms where oxygen tanks hiss between words, people finally speak. And what they say can undo decades of certainty. These are not casual admissions, they're last words, final attempts to unburden a soul or unmask a life. And in their whisper something shifts. This story begins not with one voice, but many. 10 voices, separated by years and continents, but united in timing. They all waited until the end to speak. Their secrets, some tragic, some shocking, have reshaped how families remember, how nations reckon, how history reads itself in the mirror. It starts with a man in a hospital bed in 1989. A former intelligence officer, dying of cancer, asks for a journalist. He tells a story not of remorse, but of clarity. For 4 decades, he watched a nation believe in a lone gunman, a magic bullet, and a clean story. He'd helped build that story. He names names, recalls rooms where the planning happened, describes the routes taken, the angles considered. He didn't pull the trigger, but he helped ensure it would be pulled. The story, he says, was never about one man. It was orchestration, messy, silent, deliberate. And when the story was finally published, officials scoffed. Yet his details lined up with evidence long ignored. From there, we move to a nurse in 1998 who switches 2 babies during a night shift in 1947 and lives with that secret for 50 years. Her dying words transformed the identities of 2 entire families. A police detective in 2003 confesses he helped send an innocent man to the electric chair. The real killer walked free. An engineer with ALS, barely able to move, explains how hundreds died in a factory explosion that could have been prevented if someone had just spent the money. And then come the ones that cut deeper. A man with 2 families for 35 years who tells neither the truth until he's dying. A soldier who helped erase a village in 1942. A woman who stole a baby and raised her like her own. A doctor who experimented on psychiatric patients without their consent. A forensic lab technician who faked evidence for years. A government official who helped hide a genocide. None of them expected forgiveness. Few received it. But all left behind a strange gift. The truth, or at least a piece of it. Truth not for themselves, but for others to wrestle with. Why do we wait until the end to tell the truth? Why is it only when we have nothing left to lose that we risk everything? These stories are not just about the past. They are about the present, about what we choose to remember and what we're afraid to confront, about the stories we accept because the alternatives are too painful, and about the possibility that somewhere, someone right now, is holding a truth we all deserve to know. In the episodes that follow, we'll explore each of these 10 confessions, not as tabloid shock, but as human turning points. We'll begin each with a scene, an image, a voice, and we'll end each with a question about memory, about morality, about us. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't come in the heat of action, but in the quiet before the end. And if we listen closely, we might just learn what truth sounds like when there's no time left to lie. It started with a phone call in the final days of 1989. The journalist didn't know what to expect. The voice on the other end was raspy, deliberate. A man dying of cancer, confined to a hospital bed, said he had something to share, something he hadn't dared say for 40 years. He didn't introduce himself with drama. No titles, no flair. Just a name, a location, and a past that had been carefully hidden behind routine, rank, and silence. He had worked in intelligence, not at the top, but close enough to the heart of things to see how history was written behind closed doors. He spoke of a day that still haunts the American imagination, a presidential motorcade, a bullet, a nation in mourning, For decades, the official version had held: one man, one rifle, one impossible shot. But from his hospital bed, the dying operative painted a very different picture. There were meetings, he said, months before the day of the assassination. Not one agency, but several. Not one shooter, but at least 3. Professionals, brought in for a job that needed precision and deniability. The motorcade route had been chosen deliberately, ensuring clear angles and minimal interference. Confusion, he claimed, was part of the plan. The chaos of the crowd, the echo of gunfire, tools to make the impossible seem plausible. He hadn't pulled the trigger. That wasn't his role. He was logistics, coordination, part of the quiet machinery that makes things happen without ever being seen. He watched as the country swallowed a story he knew was fabricated. The lone gunman, the magic bullet, the closed investigation. All built on altered evidence, intimidated witnesses, and vanished records. He'd stayed silent for survival. To speak then would have meant losing everything: his job, his family, perhaps his life. But now, with nothing left to protect, he decided that truth deserved a witness. When his story was published, it was dismissed as the ramblings of a man facing death. Officials called it fiction. Yet for those who'd long studied the case, it was different. He knew things, details never made public, timelines that had baffled researchers for years. His version didn't just fill in the blanks, it reshaped the entire picture. Forensic experts revisited old evidence with new questions. Testimonies long discredited began to make sense in light of multiple shooters. What had once seemed fragmented or contradictory now appeared consistent with his account. Still, his confession didn't prove everything. It didn't erase doubt. But it did something just as important. It shifted the boundaries of what could be spoken. For years, anyone who questioned the official story was branded a conspiracy theorist. After this, they were historians with new material. And the question that lingered: if one man could carry a truth like that for 40 years, how many others died with similar secrets? What happens when the version of events we've built our history on was never meant to stand scrutiny? The dying operative's story didn't end with proof, it ended with possibility. With a reminder that sometimes the version we accept isn't the one that's true, but the one that was safest to tell. In this chapter, we begin to see what happens when truth waits too long to speak, and we start to ask, not what really happened, but why we were told what we were told, and what it cost to keep the silence. It was a winter afternoon in 1998 when a grown daughter received a quiet summons. Her mother, once a nurse in a busy city hospital, was fading. Heart failure had given her weeks, maybe days. As the daughter sat beside the bed, her mother reached for her hand. What followed wasn't a farewell. It was a revelation that would unravel the lives of 8 people. In 1947, a mistake was made. The nurse had been 22, fresh out of training, caught in the chaos of a nursery overflowing with newborns. That night, exhaustion blurred her routine. 2 babies, both boys, had been out for routine checks. In returning them, she switched their identification bracelets. She realized the error almost immediately. The babies were similar, but not identical. Something in her gut said it was wrong. She hesitated. Speak up, and she'd likely lose her job, maybe face legal consequences. Stay silent, and no one might ever know. Fear chose for her. For the next 50 years, she lived with the weight of a decision she could never undo. She followed both families from a distance, reading newspaper clippings, watching from the sidelines of lives that had unfolded in opposite directions. One child grew up in privilege, attending prestigious schools and eventually entering a world of influence. The other grew up modestly in a working-class home filled with love but marked by hardship. She saw them both become men. One excelled in business, the other in resilience. But she always knew they were living the wrong lives, built on an accident no one else even suspected. On her deathbed, The truth emerged, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a final act of honesty. She gave her daughter the names, the dates, the details. After her death, her daughter contacted both families. What followed was disbelief, anger, grief. But DNA testing erased all doubt. The truth, however unbelievable, was undeniable. Two men, now in their 50s, learned that the families they'd loved their entire lives were not their biological kin. One met his birth parents and found common ground. The other could not. The distance was too vast, the disorientation too deep. What's more painful, to never know or to know too late? The confession brought answers, but no easy healing. Parents wept over children they'd never known. Brothers met siblings who felt like strangers. And two men had to reimagine the foundation of who they were. The nurse died having finally spoken her truth, but her admission left a complicated legacy. Some said it would have been better not to know. Others insisted truth, even late, was worth the pain. This chapter reminds us how fragile identity can be, how something as simple as a plastic bracelet can determine a lifetime, and how a single human mistake, made in fatigue and fear, can echo across generations. In the end, the question lingers: are we who we are because of blood or because of the lives we've lived? And if the truth challenges everything we believed, what should we hold on to? In the stillness of that hospital room, a secret died, and a truth was born. But what that truth meant was something each person would have to decide for themselves. He was 67, breathing through an oxygen mask, when he finally asked for a lawyer, not to fight a case, but to confess one. In a quiet hospice room in 2003, a retired police detective, once decorated, now dying of emphysema, told a truth that would undo a life and ripple through many more. 25 years earlier, in the glare of a high-profile murder investigation, he had stood in court and pointed a finger. He testified that a man, poor, working class, with a thin record and no alibi, was guilty of killing a wealthy homeowner. The jury believed him. The man was convicted and eventually executed. But it was a lie. The detective had known who really did it: the victim's business partner. The partner had motive, money, betrayal, resentment. He had access and influence. But he also had lawyers, friends in high places, and the kind of insulation that makes prosecution nearly impossible. The department needed a conviction. The media was circling. Politicians wanted answers. And the man who fit the public's picture of a criminal, the wrong race, the wrong income, the wrong story, was easy to pin. So the detective followed orders. He watched evidence being manufactured. Witnesses coached. Interrogation records rewritten. DNA ignored. Everything calibrated for a tidy case. He didn't speak up. He played his part. And then, years later, he watched on television as the man was executed. It didn't bring closure. It brought something else. A slow corrosion of spirit. Regret that grew louder as his body began to fail. Now, near death, he laid out everything: names, details, falsified reports, private meetings, internal memos. Enough to reopen the case, and more. Enough to indict the truth itself. The fallout was immediate. The executed man's family had always believed in his innocence, but belief is not justice. Now they had proof. Too late. Vindication doesn't bring back a life. The real killer, now elderly, was arrested. He confessed under pressure. The families of both the innocent and the guilty were left in ruins, children discovering their fathers were either victims or monsters. The officer died weeks later. His confession sparked protests, debates, investigations. And it reopened an old wound in the American justice system. How many more? The death penalty, once defended with words like certainty and finality, was now cast in a new, colder light. If one innocent man could be executed on a lie, how many others had been? This chapter isn't just about guilt, it's about complicity, about how systems reward silence, and how fear of losing a job, defying a superior, disrupting the narrative can cost a man his life. In the end, the detective's words didn't absolve him, but they served a different purpose. They showed that even in a world built on rules and badges, truth can be delayed, denied, and destroyed, until someone has nothing left to lose. And the question remains, what justice can exist in a world where the truth needs permission to be told? The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of medical equipment. In a small living room in 2007, a retired chemical engineer, his voice now weak from ALS, sat surrounded by stacks of boxes, not of keepsakes, but of documents, emails, memos, blueprints. 30 years of silence packed into manila folders. He had summoned environmental lawyers not for vengeance, but for the truth, the kind that had been buried under decades of profit and plausible deniability. In 1977, a chemical plant exploded. Over 300 people died instantly. Thousands more would suffer in the years that followed. The company called it an accident, equipment failure, a mechanical flaw no one could have seen coming. But he had seen it. Months before the disaster, he and other engineers had flagged critical safety systems, aged, outdated, incapable of handling the plant's increased capacity. They'd written reports, raised alarms. The cost of upgrading, they were told, was too high. When he protested, he was threatened. If he couldn't make do with what they had, someone else would. So he stayed. And when the plant erupted, when sirens screamed and smoke blackened the sky, he already knew what had happened. In the days that followed, the company launched its version of the story. Expert witnesses were hired, documents were sanitized, employees were warned. Lawsuits were settled with airtight non-disclosure agreements. The narrative held. It was an accident, unpredictable and tragic. But he had kept everything, not out of defiance, but out of guilt. For 3 decades, he lived with the knowledge that hundreds had died because warnings were ignored. Now, with his body failing, he couldn't die with the lie. He handed over the documents, internal emails showing how cost-cutting won over safety, engineering reports dismissed by executives, meeting notes where risks were acknowledged and accepted. When the lawyers went public, the impact was immediate. What had been labeled a tragedy was now a scandal. Criminal investigations followed. Executives were called to testify. The company's legacy unraveled in headlines and hearings. They declared bankruptcy within a year. But money couldn't fix what had been broken. Children had lost parents. Workers had lost their health. Entire communities had been exposed to poison because margins mattered more than lives. The engineer died shortly after his confession. He never saw the court rulings or the public apologies. But his last act, an unspoken plea for truth, shattered the facade. This chapter isn't about explosions. It's about silence, about the choices we make when no one is watching, and how sometimes it takes the end of a life to finally tell the story of how others lost theirs. We ask, how many disasters weren't accidents at all? How often does convenience win over conscience? And how many more truths are still waiting, hidden in basements and memory, for someone to speak them aloud? The hospital room was still, save for the low rhythm of machines and the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. In 2012, a man lay dying, not from the weight of his disease, but from the truth he could no longer hold. He was 71, a successful businessman. To his wife and adult children gathered around him, he had been a provider, a steady presence who traveled often but always returned. They had come to say goodbye. Instead, he summoned the strength to unravel their world. He had a second family, another woman, more children, a parallel life built on the architecture of lies. It had started in the early 1970s. A business trip, a moment of discontent, a connection that was supposed to be fleeting. But when she became pregnant, he made a decision not to leave his wife, not to end the affair, but to divide himself. He crafted an identity that thrived in the gaps. His company became the perfect alibi: frequent travel, late nights, long weekends. He maintained 2 homes, 2 sets of children, 2 entire narratives. For 35 years, it worked. Neither family suspected. One believed he was a hard-working executive, always on the move. The other thought he was divorced, devoted, and entirely theirs. He was meticulous. Separate bank accounts, separate holidays, lies told with the ease of habit. But now, as death pressed close, the story began to unravel. Estate documents would reveal the overlap: birth certificates, financial records, travel histories, too many threads to keep apart. So he gathered them, one family, then the other, and told the truth. The reaction was devastation. His wife of 4 decades felt her marriage had been a fiction. His children, once proud of their father's success, now saw him as a stranger. The second family, shocked and betrayed, realized they had been part of a hidden life, never the whole truth. Legal battles followed. Who inherited what? Was the second marriage valid? Were his other children entitled to anything? But more painful than the legal fallout was the emotional wreckage. Siblings who had never met now sat across from each other, sharing blood but not memories. Conversations were stiff. Connections strained. Some tried to build relationships, others walked away, unwilling to bridge a chasm built on deceit. The man died 2 months later. Neither family attended his funeral. He was buried quietly, mourned by no one. A man who had lived 2 lives died without a place in either. This confession wasn't about crime. It was about the quiet erosion of trust. The cost of living 2 truths and believing no one would ever have to know. And it raises a question that echoes beyond family secrets. Is it better to live a happy lie or a painful truth? Do the people we love deserve honesty, even if that honesty breaks them? In the end, this story reminds us that the deepest betrayals are not always in what we do, but in what we hide, and that some secrets, when revealed too late, offer no healing at all. In a quiet hospice near the end of summer 2001, a man nearing 80 made a final request, not for comfort, not for family, but for someone from a human rights organization. There was something he needed to say, something he had carried since 1942. He had been a young soldier then, just another uniform in a vast war. But the memory he carried wasn't of victory or bravery. It was of a village, one not found in most history books, and the silence that followed its destruction. The orders had come without ambiguity. Their unit was stationed in occupied territory. Intelligence claimed the village was aiding resistance fighters. The command was clear: make an example. They surrounded the village. Over 200 people, men, women, children, the elderly. No resistance, no weapons, just confusion and pleading eyes. Then came the command: execute everyone. The bodies were buried in mass graves, the homes set ablaze. Afterward, the reports told a different story: combat engagement, enemy fire, collateral damage. The truth was edited, buried under medals and dispatches. For decades, he told no one. He tried to believe what they'd been told, that it was war, that he had followed orders, that the blame rested elsewhere. But the faces stayed. In dreams, in silence, in the way sunlight filtered through trees that reminded him of the forest beyond that village. Now, with a failing heart and only days left, he decided the truth could wait no longer. He gave names, dates, coordinates. He described the village's layout, the faces of the officers who issued the orders, the soldiers who followed them. Most were now dead, but the memory remained vivid. The organization he contacted began to investigate. Using wartime archives, satellite images, and interviews with aging local residents, they found it. The village had existed. The ruins were still there. Ground-penetrating radar detected signs of mass graves. Excavations confirmed it. Bodies of civilians, executed, burned, buried. The revelation sent ripples through military institutions and historical societies. The military acknowledged the likelihood of a massacre, but framed it as an isolated event. Survivors' families, who had passed stories down through generations, finally had confirmation of what they always knew. The story that had been silenced was now undeniable. The veteran died shortly after giving his testimony. He never saw the reports, the news, the apology. But his confession did something that the war had denied. It gave the victims a voice. This chapter reminds us that history is often written by those who survive it, and sometimes rewritten by those who can no longer live with it. That the horrors of war are not only in the battles fought, but in the truths buried to protect those who gave the orders. And so we ask, when a soldier follows orders that history later calls a crime, where does the guilt end? With the command, the rifle, or the silence that follows? In that village, the silence lasted 6 decades, and one man's final breath broke it. It was a name once whispered in missing persons bulletins and faded newspaper clippings. A baby girl taken from a hospital nursery in 1969. A case that went cold. A grief that never did. In 2014, a woman lay dying in a hospice bed, her body ravaged by cancer. At 68, she summoned the strength to place a call to the FBI. Her voice was weak, but what she said would alter 2 families forever. She had taken the child, not a stranger with dark motives, not a trafficker or predator, but a woman who had lost too many children of her own, who had broken under the weight of repeated miscarriages and untreated despair. On that day in 1969, she had walked into the hospital dressed as a nurse. No one questioned her. No one noticed when she walked out cradling a newborn in a blanket. She moved across state lines, created a false identity, registered the baby as her own, and then, for 45 years, she raised her. Birthdays, bedtime stories, first days of school, graduation, a wedding, grandchildren, all lived in the shadow of a lie. The girl, now a woman in her mid-40s, had no idea she wasn't who she believed she was. And the woman who raised her? Loving, kind, attentive. Everything a mother should be, except for the truth. The confession was detailed. Dates, places, hospital records, even the stolen hospital bracelet. DNA testing confirmed it. The missing baby had not died. She had been living a parallel life just a few states away. The woman's biological parents, now elderly, had spent decades wondering, grieving, holding on to fading hope. When they finally met their daughter, the moment was surreal. She was familiar, yet foreign. She smiled like her mother, tilted her head like her father, but knew nothing of them. Reunion was not simple. Joy clashed with confusion. A longing fulfilled, but too late. They were family by blood, but not by memory. And then there was the kidnapper, the woman who had raised her. She was dying, frail and full of remorse. But she had also given a life filled with love. The daughter she had stolen now faced the impossible task of reconciling 2 truths. Her mother was both a criminal and her greatest source of comfort. The kidnapper died before charges could be filed. Some felt justice had been denied. Others felt it had been delivered in the form of the truth itself. This story isn't just about abduction, it's about identity. About the blurry line between nurture and deception. It's about the pain of finding out that everything you believed about your origin was fabricated, not to harm you, but to hold on to something the world had denied. In the end, a missing person was found. But the reunion raised more questions than answers. Who are we without the stories we've been told about ourselves? And if the person who gave us love did so through a stolen life, can we ever truly forgive them? This confession reminds us that sometimes the truth doesn't set us free. It dismantles everything we thought we knew and leaves us to rebuild from what remains. In 2009, as liver failure quietly unraveled his body, a retired psychiatrist picked up the phone and asked to speak to a medical ethics investigator. He had carried something for decades, not guilt alone, but knowledge. Knowledge of what had been done under the guise of medicine in the forgotten corners of state institutions. He had been young once, ambitious, eager to prove that psychiatric disorders could be treated with new, aggressive methods. In the 1970s, the place he worked was both a haven and a cage, a state psychiatric hospital where the patients had few rights and even fewer visitors. Oversight was minimal. Records were paper. The walls kept in more than just illness. They kept secrets. Without consent, he ran experiments, not with malice but with certainty. Experimental drug combinations at dangerously high doses. Electrochemical trials. Seizures followed. Cognitive damage. In some cases, patients lost speech, memory, or the ability to care for themselves. And when it happened, he marked it down as a progression of their condition. He wasn't alone. Other doctors did the same. Some were curious, some were careless. All of them worked in a system that looked the other way. The medical records were altered, treatments rewritten. Deaths attributed to mental decline, never to the drugs. Patients who had arrived with manageable conditions left as shells of themselves, if they left at all. As ethics standards tightened in the 1980s, the experiments ceased. He moved to a different hospital, built a career, became respected. But the faces of the damaged stayed with him. The woman who no longer recognized her own name, the teenager who regressed to infancy, the man who screamed at shadows only after the injections began. Now, with nothing left to protect, he told the truth. Names, dosages, protocols, patient charts hidden in storage rooms. The investigators were stunned. When they probed deeper, they discovered this wasn't an isolated case. Unauthorized experiments had been systemic. Some patients were still alive, living with impairments they'd never understood. Others had died without ever knowing what had been done to them. Families who had long blamed themselves for institutionalizing loved ones learned the damage had come from the very people entrusted with care. Lawsuits followed. Reforms were passed. But most of the perpetrators were already gone, retired, or dead. The doctor's confession, though vital, came too late to stop the harm. He died quietly. No trial, no reckoning beyond the record he left behind. This chapter speaks to the shadow side of progress. The cost of ambition untempered by ethics, and the danger of systems where those without power become experiments in someone else's hypothesis. And we must ask, in the name of science, how many people were sacrificed without consent? When knowledge is gained through suffering, can it ever be used without shame? Some truths, once spoken, demand more than apology. They demand that we never forget the cost of silence masquerading as science. In 2016, as brain cancer dimmed her final days, a former forensic technician made a confession that sent shockwaves through a justice system she once served. Her words came slowly, but each one carried the weight of years. She had sabotaged evidence, knowingly, repeatedly, for over a decade and a half. She hadn't begun as a villain. She started in a state crime lab, processing DNA, cataloging samples, believing in the system. But under the weight of exhaustion, low pay, and relentless caseloads, shortcuts began. A skipped sterilization here, a mislabeled vial there. Small things at first, barely noticeable. Then the mistakes began to pile up. Instead of admitting error, she altered reports, manipulated files. Once the cover-ups began, they couldn't stop. It became a pattern. Contaminated evidence, falsified results, compromised chain of custody. Her fear of being discovered grew into a strategy of sabotage. Better to ruin the evidence than be caught in failure. Over time, It wasn't just a few cases, it was hundreds. Some led to wrongful convictions. Others allowed the guilty to walk free. After leaving the lab, she tried to forget. But every time she saw a crime show, a courtroom drama, or a headline about a trial that hinged on forensic evidence, the guilt flared up. Then came the diagnosis: terminal, inoperable. With months to live, she decided the truth deserved daylight. She contacted attorneys, gave them everything: case files, lab logs, annotations, even personal notes hidden away for years. The fallout was immediate. The justice system reeled. Hundreds of cases were reopened. Dozens of incarcerated individuals were released. Some had spent years behind bars for crimes they hadn't committed. Families were torn between relief and fury. Prosecutors had to revisit convictions once thought airtight. And the public trust in forensic science, once a gold standard, suffered a deep wound. The technician died before facing legal consequences. For many, that felt like injustice. But for those exonerated, her confession was both liberation and torment. They had their freedom, but the years lost could never be returned. This chapter isn't about malice. It's about neglect, about what happens when systems fail quietly, when human error, fear, and institutional pressure intersect in the worst way. We often think of justice as blind, but what if it's simply exhausted, understaffed, and too proud to admit mistakes? Her story asks us to reconsider the machinery of truth we so often trust: the labs, the science, the reports stamped with certainty. And to ask, how many verdicts were built on a foundation already cracking? Because when the evidence is broken, the truth becomes just another casualty. In a dim nursing home room in 2018, a 94-year-old man summoned a journalist, not for a legacy piece, not for nostalgia, but for a truth too large to carry any longer. His voice trembled, not from age, but from what he was about to unearth. For over half a century, he had helped hide a genocide. He had been a mid-level government administrator in the 1960s, a man with no weapon, no uniform, but access to the paperwork that made violence official. Back then, his country had faced economic crisis. The blame, as so often happens, fell on a vulnerable minority. The solution, devised behind locked doors, was elimination. Entire regions were sealed off under the pretense of military operations against rebels. But there were no rebels. What followed was systematic: mass roundups, executions, shallow graves. Over 100,000 men, women, and children killed not by accident, but by policy. He hadn't pulled a trigger. He hadn't stood at the edge of a pit. But he had written the memos, signed the orders, drafted the reports that turned genocide into bureaucracy. And he had helped craft the story that would endure: a civil disturbance, a regrettable but limited clash. The real numbers were buried, literally and politically. Documents were destroyed. Journalists were kept out. Survivors were silenced. History books were rewritten. And for over 50 years, the lie held. But as the man faced his final months, the silence became unbearable. He gave the journalist names, locations, coordinates, not just memories, but evidence. The investigation that followed shook the nation. Satellite imagery revealed the outlines of mass graves in places long abandoned. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what survivors had always whispered: that entire villages had vanished, their people erased from record, but not from memory. Eventually, under international pressure, the government acknowledged the likelihood of atrocities. A commission was formed. Excavations began. Families who had been told their loved ones had fled or died in crossfire now learned the truth. They had been targeted and executed. The official died before the full report was published, but his confession cracked a dam that had held for generations. This chapter forces us to confront the fragility of history, how entire truths can be edited out of textbooks, erased by governments, denied by design. and how the deepest crimes are often not just about death, but about silence. When atrocity is hidden by those who shape the narrative, what hope is there for truth to survive? We are left with the chilling knowledge that this was not just one man's secret. It was an entire nation's amnesia, one that endured until a dying bureaucrat decided to speak. And it leaves us wondering, how many more truths have been buried, not by time, but by intent? Across continents and decades, from war zones to hospital rooms, each of these stories shares something deeper than just secrecy. They are not only about what was hidden, but when it was revealed, at the edge of life, when nothing more could be taken and nothing more could be protected. These deathbed confessions ripple with finality. Each one is a moment where truth, long silenced by fear or convenience, was finally allowed to speak. Not because the time was right, but because time had run out. In each story, the confession changed everything. An assassination exposed as coordinated, a child switched at birth. A massacre denied by official history, a justice system cracked by deliberate sabotage. And with each revelation, the world tilted just slightly, toward truth, or at least toward a more honest reckoning. Why wait so long? The answer is both deeply human and profoundly troubling. Fear, loyalty, shame, survival. Speaking out would have meant losing careers, families, even lives. So the silence continued until the threat of consequences vanished with the nearness of death. And yet these moments also reveal a paradox, that sometimes the end of life is the only place where the truth can safely begin. But this also forces a harder question. How many truths never made it to confession? How many people died with secrets clenched tight? Not every life ends in a whisper to a journalist or a lawyer. Many end suddenly, with stories still locked away. Some secrets are buried not by choice, but by chance. So we're left not just with revelations, but with absences. For every one of these 10 stories, there may be hundreds, thousands more. Untold betrayals, hidden tragedies, lives altered by decisions no one ever admitted. These confessions urge us to reconsider how we think about truth, not as something stable or obvious, but as something fragile, shaped by fear, protected by silence, and often revealed only when it's too late to undo the harm. They remind us that the most powerful truths are sometimes the ones we don't want to hear. That truth has a cost, and that sometimes the only thing more dangerous than the lie is the silence that covers it. As we near the end of this journey, we must ask, what secrets do we still live among? What truths are waiting in the quiet moments before goodbye, and are we willing to listen before it's too late to act? In every confession we've heard so far, there's a release, painful, imperfect, but spoken. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth is what remains unspoken. The final story isn't about one person. It's about all of them. It's about the pattern they form when viewed together, like stars in a night sky suddenly forming a shape. One confession alone is a tragedy or a curiosity. 10 begin to form a map. They show us the cost of silence. Children raised in false families, innocent people executed, entire communities destroyed or denied. They show how easy it is for truth to be buried, not only by governments or institutions, but by individuals, quietly, day after day, year after year. What made these confessions powerful wasn't just their content. It was their timing. There was no longer anything to protect, no careers to salvage, no reputations to uphold. Death made honesty safer than deception. But this raises the final, most uncomfortable truth. Many people never got that chance. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden strokes. Not every death allows for confession. Some secrets died mid-sentence or before the sentence ever began. That's what makes these stories rare and terrifying. They don't just ask us to consider what was hidden, they ask us to wonder what still is. For every veteran who admitted to a massacre, how many more never spoke? For every official who revealed a genocide, how many more still deny one? For every man or woman who finally whispered the truth, how many died clinging to the lie? There is no neat ending here. These aren't stories designed to soothe or to satisfy. They are meant to disturb, to shake loose our comfort with the idea that history is settled, that families are always what they seem, that justice is a closed case. And yet there's something oddly hopeful in all of this, not in the pain itself, but in the act of telling. In the belief, however late, that truth still matters, because when people finally speak, after decades of silence, fear, and shame, they remind us that it's never entirely too late to seek the truth, even if it arrives in the final breath. And so we close the final chapter not with resolution, but with a door left ajar. What truths do we still carry? What histories are we still helping to hide? And who among us, years from now, might find the courage to finally speak? The room is quiet now. The voices have finished. Their stories of betrayal, revelation, redemption, and regret linger like dust suspended in sunlight. What binds them isn't just confession. It's time. The ticking clock. The narrowing days. When death becomes a certainty, truth becomes a choice. Each of these 10 final confessions fractured something we thought was whole. A trusted father revealed a double life. A devoted mother turned out to be a kidnapper. Professionals we believed in, doctors, detectives, engineers, admitted to crimes cloaked in routine. Some confessions brought justice. Others brought only sorrow. None brought closure. But they gave us something else. The knowledge that truth, even delayed, still has power. That silence is never neutral. And that secrets are rarely buried for good. The epilogue to these stories isn't just about the people who spoke. It's about the world they left behind, a world that now must decide what to do with what was uncovered. Do we learn from the engineer's quiet rebellion? From the nurse's lifelong remorse? From the veteran's long-delayed reckoning? Or do we too wait until time runs out? In the end, these stories are about us, about the things we hold back, the truths we hesitate to tell, the moments when silence feels safer than honesty. They remind us that every lie we live with or ignore casts a shadow over someone else's life. So what now? What do we do with these stories? We listen, we remember, we ask the hard questions, not just of others, but of ourselves. And we consider what it would mean to speak the truth not at the end, but now, while there's still time to make things right. Because the real legacy of these deathbed confessions isn't just the revelations themselves, it's the echo they leave behind. A whisper asking, quietly but insistently, what truth are you still carrying? And when will you let it go?